Our Bible teaching is from the story in Genesis. Jacob lived in the land where the father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their fathers loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "Oh, they have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, he plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Oh, let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Midianites' merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Then he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah and gave him Aneseth, daughter of Potiphera, a priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Hunter, God's blessing.
As you can tell, this morning, the Bible character that we're talking about is Joseph. I wanted to make a little bit of a clarification on last week's sermon. You may like this. Some of you may not. We'll see. So last week I talked about Joshua. And Joshua was one who stared his greatest fears in the eye and stepped forward into the promised land. And I referred to a book by Brene Brown called Daring Greatly when I used the phrase, "dare to be great." And I challenged us as a congregation, and I challenged myself to dare to be great. The response from the sermon was overwhelmingly positive, but there were a few questions. Someone came up to me and said, "Hunter, well, our church already is great." And I said, "Yeah, that's not what I was saying." And I think they thought that I was referred to make America great again, which is not what I was trying to say about our congregation. This is a wonderful and amazing congregation filled with wonderful and amazing people. But the encouragement is to take steps of faith, to be courageous in the face of our fears, to step out and try new things. So as I thought about it, I recognized maybe the word great bothers us a little bit in our humility, sometimes for me in our false humility. So I've decided maybe the phrase that I'm going to go with is daring to be courageous. I think Brene Brown would be okay with that. So the phrase daring to be courageous, how are we daring to be courageous? And Joseph is a man who dares to be courageous over and over again. So Rose read so eloquently the beginnings of this story. Joseph's brothers are jealous of him, so they throw him into a cistern, and then they decide to sell him to slavery because, well, he's their brother and they don't feel like they should kill him. Wasn't that nice of them? They sell him into slavery, and he ends up in Potiphar's house. Potiphar is one of the head guards of the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh. Potiphar probably has lots of wealth, has lots of things to take care of, and before long, Joseph is taking care of all of his stuff. And all of his stuff is thriving and succeeding, whatever that looked like. His house is being well maintained, well cared for. Joseph is really strong administratively. Sounds a little bit like Daniel. And everything is going great for Joseph. Here he is in slavery, but he is doing the best that he can to bless Potiphar. And it even says in one of the verses, I think it's chapter 39, verse 5, it says, from the time that he got put Potiphar, put him in charge, Joseph, of his house and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. Joseph is in a terrible situation. He is a slave. But somehow, he takes the opportunity to bless Potiphar, and God blesses Potiphar through him. And it would seem that Joseph was a relatively good-looking guy, and this created a problem for Potiphar's wife. So we see this picture as the story goes on. She's pursuing him, and finally she sort of gives him an ultimatum, and he says, "Look, Potiphar, your husband has given me everything. I'm a slave. I deserve none of this stuff. He's put me in charge of everything. Everything that's Potiphar's is mine except for you. I cannot possibly take you." And so he ran out of the room, and she ended up, because she was hanging onto some of his clothing, she had some of his clothing in her hand, and in her frustration and her anger, she finally says, "Okay, I'm going to deal with Joseph. This guy who was beaten up by his brothers and sold into slavery now goes to prison because Potiphar's wife goes to her husband and says, 'Joseph asked me to lay with him. What are you going to do about it?'" So what happens in jail, right? Joseph is Joseph. Nothing changes about who Joseph is. He goes to jail, and before we know what happens, he is the greatest prisoner of all time. And the jailer gives him all the responsibilities of feeding and taking care of all of the other prisoners. So he's the guy that when a new prisoner comes in, teaches him how everything works. He's the guy that makes sure that everyone is cared for. He is the guy that makes sure that everyone is getting all the food that they need. The jailer doesn't have to worry about anything. He's got Joseph. No, but I don't know about you. If I would find myself in prison for something that I didn't do, I would probably spend most of my time trying to figure out how I was going to get out, or pouting and fussing about the terrible situation that I'm in, but not Joseph. Over and over again, when Joseph is put in a position that would make me cry, Joseph stands up and blesses the people around him. It's almost as if, instead of wondering about how he could get to a certain position in life, instead of wondering how he could get back to his brothers, instead of sitting and thinking, woe is me for all the things that have happened to him, he's decided that his job in life is to bless people. His job in life is to bless people right where he's at, wherever God puts him. And that's changed everything for Joseph. And suddenly, everywhere he goes, every bad situation he's in, he's making the world into a better place. So, into the prison comes the baker and the king's cupbearer. The king's cupbearer was a person that was very close to the king, because the king's cupbearer had the delightful job of trying all of the wine and all of the food that would be served to the king, so if it was poisoned, the cupbearer would die and the king wouldn't. Wonderful, another sort of envious position to be put in. But we don't know what he did, and we don't know what the baker did, but they both upset the king, and they find themselves in prison. On a certain night, they both have dreams about their lives. And they wake up and they're like, does anybody here know how to interpret dreams? And Joseph's like, well, I can't interpret dreams, because of course that's what Joseph would say, but my God can. So Joseph interprets the dreams for both the baker and the cupbearer. For the cupbearer, the dream is going to send him in 3 days back to be beside the king, the Pharaoh, as he had been before. The baker, on the other hand, is going to get killed and put onto a post. Both things happened. As the cupbearer is heading back to the king, Joseph sort of says on the way, don't forget me. Remember me, I've been good to you. But the cupbearer, in all of his excitement of getting back into his spot, forgets about Joseph. 2 years goes by. And Pharaoh himself starts to have these crazy dreams. 2 dreams. Every time it was 2 dreams, kind of saying the same thing. And he has these 2 dreams, and one of the dreams being there's 7 fat cows, and then there's 7 skinny, gaunt cows, and the skinny, gaunt cows eat the fat cows. And so Pharaoh gathers all of his wisest people together, and he says, what do these dreams mean? What are they supposed to be telling us? Nobody has any idea. So the cupbearer is there because he's always next to the king, and this light bulb goes off in his head. And he says, wait a minute, I know somebody that interprets dreams. So of course, Pharaoh sends for Joseph. Joseph comes, he gets all cleaned up, goes to stand before the king. The king says, can you interpret my dreams? Joseph says, no, I can't interpret your dreams, but my God can. And he tells them that what's going to happen is that there are going to be 7 years of incredible plenty. 7 years where whatever you plant is going to grow and just burst forth from the earth with all sorts of fruit of your labor. And then there's going to be 7 years of famine. So he says, if I were in your shoes, Pharaoh, I would take the 7 years of plenty and I would fill as much grain and fruits into the store bins as you possibly can so that you can eat them during the years of famine. And Pharaoh looks at him and says, this sounds like a pretty good plan. Why don't you lead this plan for me? And this was the part that we heard from chapter 41, where Pharaoh is putting him in charge of everything, gives him his signet ring, which means that whatever he stamps with the signet ring is sort of gospel. It is whatever Pharaoh says or whatever Joseph says, anyone is supposed to do. He is the right-hand man to Pharaoh. Over and over and over again, Joseph lands on his feet in the midst of his struggles, in the midst of his deepest challenges. And now Joseph is blessing all of Egypt. Now, he was given a wife, and he had children. And I love the names of his children say so much about the scripture and about what it means. I think it is in verse 41:50. Yes. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. By Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. These bad things that have happened to Joseph happened to him because of the brokenness of humanity. They happened to him because of the greed and the desire to grab for what is not theirs of his brothers and of Potiphar's wife. God did not make these bad things happen to him, but he recognizes in the name of his Son that God blesses us in the midst of our brokenness. God lifts us up and makes good happen out of our bad situations. Then his second son, he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of his suffering. God has made me fruitful in the land of his suffering. Again, God is with us in the midst of our deepest, darkest challenges. God blesses us and makes good out of challenging situations. And God has been good to him. And then God blesses others through us. God blesses others through him. That was his job. That was his main goal. And it sort of came into everything that he did. But the story is not over yet. We have to deal with the brothers. In the time of famine, Jacob is Joseph's father. Jacob has heard that there is food in Egypt. So he tells his sons to go to Egypt to find and to buy food. Jacob has no idea that Joseph is still alive. He thinks Joseph is dead. The brothers don't have any idea what has happened to Joseph, but they don't think for a second they're going to find him when they go to buy grain. And there he is. They go and they meet him. Joseph knows that they're his brothers. They do not know who he is. They can't recognize him in all that Egyptian garb. And we have this moment where I think to myself, in a good story, a really good story, Joseph would have his brothers thrown in jail for their injustice. Because that's what we think should happen, right? These are horrible people. What they did to him was horrendous. First, they beat him up and they threw him into a pit. And then they said, oh, wait a minute, we can get money out of this situation. Let's sell this punk, the dreamer. and tell our father that he was eaten by a lion. They deserve anything they get. But you remember, Joseph's job, his role, the thing that he wanted to do more than anything else was to bless others. Maybe one of the most powerful ways that we can bless others is through forgiveness. So we have this story of this sort of back and forth with Joseph and the brothers. He sends them away, they come back. He listens to them in prison. Again, they don't know that he understands their language. And they're in the prison and the brothers are talking. It's like he gets the chance to be the fly on the wall. And the brothers are like, maybe all of this is happening to us because we killed our brother Joseph. Maybe all of this is God punishing us. Maybe we're in prison, this Egyptian prison, because God is punishing us for the things that we have done. And then Joseph comes to them again, and he says that he is going to send them all back to their father, but he wants the youngest brother Benjamin. And I'm kind of filling some cracks here. Benjamin would have actually been Joseph's full-blooded brother. Benjamin was the only son that would have been of Jacob and Joseph's mother, because Jacob had lots of wives. We'll have a sermon on that some other day. Or not. So Joseph so desperately wanted to meet Benjamin. But the brothers thought he was trying to keep Benjamin as a punishment. So Judah, the one that sold him into slavery, stands up and says, I will take Benjamin's place. And it was in that moment of repentance, that Joseph just breaks down and weeps and invites his brothers and his entire family to come to Egypt. Come and be with us. And we see a moment of reconciliation and forgiveness. One of the most powerful ways, if not the most powerful way that we can bless others, is to forgive. Just think about any given day that you have in your life. How many times are you offended? Are you hurt by someone, or maybe even by yourself? When someone pulls in front of you, when someone gives you that look of disapproval? Over and over again, we have opportunities throughout the day where we are injured or hurt by people. Over and over again, we have opportunities to forgive and to bless. And just in case we're not certain how powerful forgiveness is, just in case we're not certain that that's really what this story is about, we remember Jesus. Jesus, who comes and lives in our midst and teaches our disciples how to be a blessing. What does he do ultimately in the end? What is the greatest act of blessing that Jesus will do for each and every one of us? He dies on the cross to forgive us of our sins, because like the brothers, like Potiphar's wife, inevitably as human beings, we will hurt each other. With the best of intentions sometimes with the worst of intentions, we hurt each other and we make mistakes. And one of the most powerful ways that we can bless one another is to forgive. God invites us to be a blessing. Now, it became kind of interesting to me as I thought about what's going to happen this morning as we're about ready to participate in communion. The brothers, the men of injustice, come to Joseph seeking grain for life, and they receive forgiveness. So too today we come to Christ seeking life, the bread of life, Jesus' spiritual life, and in the midst of it we receive the cup as well, God's forgiveness. Today, like the brothers, we come before the Lord, recognizing together that we need all the Jesus that we can get. And though we don't like to admit it, we need that cup as well. We will be participating in communion today as an opportunity to remember God with us, as an opportunity to remember our calling in the midst of any situation that we might find ourselves to be a blessing. We will come together wrestling with what that might look like for each of us. Now, this is the logistical part that I want to explain.